Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on one of those fog-choked mornings of early November that the case first arrived in our Baker Street lodgings, not in the form of a visitor at the door, as so often was the custom, but via a most curious item published in the Daily Telegraph. I'd been perusing the paper absent-mindedly, my attention drifting between a tepid cup of tea and the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock, when a short article on page 6 seized me like a wire through the spine. Barrister found dead in locked archive room, no sign of entry. "Holmes," I called, scarcely believing the headline. "Have you seen this?" He was at the window, peering through the yellow murk at a passing brougham, his violin untouched since the morning. Without turning, he said, "I do believe, Watson, that you are referring to the matter of Mr. Archibald Knox of Lincoln's Inn." "How the devil?" "Lestrade sent a telegram at precisely 6 minutes past 8. You were in the bath. The death occurred under impossible circumstances. The room was bolted from the inside, the key found still in the victim's waistcoat pocket, and the only other exit, an iron-framed window, latched shut from within and barred by a filing cabinet." I stared at him, paper in hand. "And the man is dead?" "Very much so. A respected barrister, aged 52. No sign of violence upon his person, no weapon, no disturbance in the room, and—" He turned now, eyes glittering with keen anticipation. Not a single footprint in the thin film of dust that coated the interior floor. A death with no cause, no intruder, and no exit. It was, as the article dryly concluded, an enigma worthy of fiction. Holmes stretched his long limbs and reached for his frock coat. "Come, Watson, we are invited." It was nearing 10 o'clock when we arrived at Lincoln's Inn. The chill had only worsened, the fog now a woolen shroud that choked sound and light. Our cabman left us near the archway, and we made our way on foot toward the eastern block of chambers. Lestrade, compact and sharp-eyed, was waiting for us at the threshold of the archive wing, his hat in hand and a haggard look etched into his narrow face. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Doctor, it's a strange one, this." "Indeed," Holmes replied, stepping past him. "Is the room untouched?" "Precisely as we found it. We've not moved the body." Lestrade led us down a corridor flanked by shelves of bound volumes, the smell of old paper and dust thick in the air. We passed under a stone archway and through a heavy oak door into the archive chamber. The room was windowless on 3 sides, with only one high, narrow window above the filing cabinets at the far end. The single gas lamp overhead sputtered, casting a jittery amber light on the scene. The body of Mr. Archibald Knox sat slumped in an armchair near the center of the room, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. He wore a neat grey waistcoat, and his pince-nez hung lopsided on his nose. His expression was peaceful, almost resigned. "Time of death?" Holmes asked, already kneeling. "Likely between 1 and 3 this morning. The cleaning woman found the body at 7 sharp. The door was locked from within. Key in the waistcoat pocket as stated." "And the window?" Lestrade gestured to the iron-framed panel behind the cabinet. "Still latched. Dust on the sill undisturbed. No way in or out." Holmes stood and surveyed the room. "You said he was alone?" "Yes. The secretary said Mr. Knox occasionally worked late in the archive. He'd borrowed a set of briefs to review. Said he didn't want to be disturbed." Holmes moved to the door. "And the lock?" Lestrade produced a brass key from his pocket. "Standard mortise lock. No sign of tampering." Holmes examined the door frame, then pressed his ear to the panel, tapping lightly. "Solid. And what about the papers he was reviewing?" Lestrade pointed to a leather satchel on the table. "Unopened. Still clasped shut." Holmes lifted the satchel, inspecting its edges and stitching. He set it down, unopened, and turned to me. "Observe, Watson. A man enters a secure room, bolts himself in, reads nothing, disturbs nothing. and dies with no visible cause. The dust reveals no prints but his own. The key is on his person, and no one heard a sound, not even the night watchman, whose station is a mere 20 feet away. It's, I struggled to form the words, utterly baffling. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. He turned to Lestrade. Have you examined the victim? Dr. Hammerly from Bart's gave a quick once-over. He could find no wounds, no bruises, nothing to suggest violence or poison. Bloodless. Holmes pulled out a small magnifying lens from his breast pocket and began to inspect the deceased's fingertips, nostrils, and lips. After several minutes, he stood upright and said, "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Lestrade. Often it is the absence of something rather than its presence that provides the key." Lestrade frowned. "And what exactly is absent?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Precisely the question we must pursue." He moved once more around the chamber, taking in the details. The soot marks on the lamp chimney, the faint scuff on the cabinet leg, a broken nib on the desk. Then he turned, almost casually, to the satchel again and gave it a gentle shake. A muffled rattle responded. "Watson, would you be so kind as to note this? A man dies in a locked room, touching none of the papers he came to examine, with a closed satchel he never opened. Yet inside it, something rattles." I opened my notebook. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That whatever killed Mr. Knox may not be within the room, but may have arrived with him." Chapter 2. The game begins. It was not until we were back at Baker Street, the shadows long across the floorboards and the kettle sputtering low on the hob, that Holmes finally broke his silence. Throughout our return from Lincoln's Inn, he had remained deep in thought, eyes half-lidded, fingertips pressed together, and lips moving now and then in silent calculation. Even when I had attempted to provoke conversation by raising a few modest theories, the possibility of a disguised poison or some ingenious mechanical device, he had waved me off with a distant murmur and resumed his inward retreat. Now he stood at the window once more, that familiar silhouette against the evening fog, while I filled our cups. "Tea, Holmes?" He accepted it without turning. "Thank you, Watson." I sat across from him, placing my notebook upon my lap. "Well then, we have a man found dead in a sealed room, with no sign of struggle, no apparent injuries, and no visible method of entry or exit. Surely even you must admit that it borders on the supernatural." Holmes let out a soft huff. "Nothing is supernatural, Watson, only super-obscured." I frowned. "And what, precisely, obscures this case? The very thing that makes it appear unsolvable. The stillness, the order, the silence." I shook my head. "I confess, Holmes, I am more confused now than I was inside the archive." He turned abruptly, the gaslight catching the edges of his sharp cheekbones. "Then let us reassemble what we know, not with the aim of solving it, but to see what questions the facts insist upon." I opened my notebook, eager despite myself. "Fact the first," he began, pacing slowly. "Mr. Archibald Knox was discovered at 7 o'clock in the morning, seated in a chair, in a locked archive room with no evidence of intrusion. The door was bolted, the window barred, and the key found on his person." "Agreed." "Fact the second, the satchel he brought was unopened, yet it contained some object heavy enough to rattle audibly when shaken. Possibly papers or legal instruments." Holmes raised a finger. "Yet Knox did not so much as open it, though he specifically stated to his secretary that he was staying late to review the materials inside." I considered this. So he never accomplished what he intended to do. "Correct. Now, the third fact. No signs of poison, no injuries, no contortions of pain. Our good Dr. Hammerly found nothing." Holmes came to a stop by the fireplace. "And so we must ask, why would a man enter a room with the purpose of reading a file, close himself inside, and perish in perfect stillness before he even opened the satchel?" The question hung in the air like a cobweb. "It's as though something awaited him," I said slowly. Holmes gave me a rare smile. "Yes, and yet the room, Watson. Dust on the floor, dust on the shelves, no prints but his own. Either something was brought with him and released there, or nothing at all occurred except within the man himself." I stared into my tea. Could it have been a natural death, a heart condition? Holmes shook his head. Perhaps, but not likely. Knox was a man of robust constitution. You saw his hands, calloused, thick-fingered, steady. Not the hands of a man prone to sudden fits of mortality. He strode to his desk and began leafing through his clipping files. "What troubles me more, Watson, is the quietness of the room." There was no overturning of furniture, no sign of sudden collapse. He appears to have sat down and simply expired. "Peacefully," I added. "Peacefully, but not purposelessly." Which brings us to the question, what could cause death so swiftly, without leaving a mark, while allowing the victim time to sit, prepare himself, and wait? I opened my mouth, then hesitated. Suicide. Holmes paused mid-page, eyes narrowing. Possible. But then the means should be evident, and yet no vial, no powder, no ligature, no weapon. Unless he swallowed something beforehand? Holmes tapped his fingers on the file drawer. A theory we may test. I've sent for the post-mortem report from Bart's. It should arrive by morning. Until then, let us turn to what I believe is the true entry point into this case. He withdrew a small paper envelope from his coat pocket and held it up. Do you recall the dust? The floor? Indeed. Only one set of footprints, but the floor was not uniformly dusty. Around the chair there was a patch of disturbed grains, a fine silvery scatter. You noted it? I thought it was ash. Not ash, powder, and very specific. He opened the envelope and revealed a few grains on a folded sheet of paper. He held it to the lamp. See the iridescence? It is a compound known as Valerian tin calx, used in minute quantities by watchmakers for balancing springs. Highly stable, non-toxic, and almost invisible in daylight. But why would it be near a barrister's chair? My mind raced. Perhaps he was tampering with a watch? Possibly. So perhaps something was tampering with him. He replaced the grains and closed the envelope. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to Mr. Knox's chambers. There is something about this man that does not align with the facts of his death. I want to know who he was, truly was. Not merely his profession, but his connections, his temperament, his history. Holmes paused and gave a small, thoughtful frown. There is another matter. Yes. Did you notice the ink blot on the archive desk? I thought back. Near the broken nib? Holmes nodded. A smear of violet ink, not fresh, but not more than a day old. Curiously positioned, as though someone had attempted to write, hesitated, and then abandoned the effort. Was it his? I don't think so. There was no paper in the blotter, no envelope, no note. What's more, Knox wrote with blue ink. According to his secretary, violet was not his custom. I leaned forward. Then someone else was in that room before him. Holmes's smile was thin and sharp. Perhaps, or someone else expected to be there after him. He turned back to the window. This is no ordinary locked room puzzle, Watson. It is a riddle built within another. A man died without lifting a hand, and yet I suspect his death is only the second event in a much larger chain. He tapped the glass twice with a long finger. Mark my words. This puzzle will solve another. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. We returned to Lincoln's Inn the next morning under a grim and sallow sky. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving the pavements glossed like black marble, and a wind howled between the narrow alleys like a restless ghost. Yet Holmes walked with purpose. His step light and quick, his eyes flicking from the rooftops to the flagstones as if the very buildings whispered secrets to him. The porter admitted us without question, and soon we were once more standing outside the archive room. Lestrade was already there, sleeves rolled, muttering irritably to one of his constables. "I must say, Holmes," the inspector greeted us, "I'm not sure what you hope to find. We swept the room from corner to corner yesterday. Nothing's changed." Precisely why I asked to see it again in precisely the same condition, Holmes replied, removing his gloves. A scene once familiar becomes deceptive upon return. The mind fills in what it expects to see. But if you shift your perspective, he gestured at a table to the left of the entrance. "That lamp. It was lit when we arrived yesterday." "Yes?" Lestrade glanced at it. "It was. One of the clerks lit it after they found the body. The room has no windows save the high slot behind the cabinet." Holmes nodded slowly, crouching to examine the table's edge. "Then what do you make of this?" He pointed to a small line of dark residue along the underside of the lamp's base. I knelt beside him and saw it clearly, a thin crescent of black soot where the base had once sat but now no longer aligned. "It's been moved," I said. "Moved and turned," Holmes replied. "Someone wanted it to appear undisturbed. But this residue suggests it was repositioned recently. The question, of course, is why." Lestrade frowned. "Could have been the cleaner." "No," Holmes said flatly. "Mrs. Jepson is a creature of habit. I had a brief word with her this morning. She avoids touching objects that do not clearly belong to the cleaning routine. This lamp was intentionally moved, subtly, but with purpose." He stood and walked to the center of the room, gazing again at the armchair where Mr. Knox had been found. The room was colder today, somehow emptier in his absence. "I want to test something," Holmes said. He took a match from his coat and lit the lamp, then walked around the room, watching how the shadows played on the walls. "Now, Watson, stand in the spot where the chair was. Look toward the lamp." I obeyed, and immediately saw what he meant. The angle of the light was wrong. The shadows fell sharply behind the desk, illuminating not the satchel, but the wall beyond it. Had Knox been seated here, the light would not have allowed him to read anything clearly. Holmes stepped beside me. "This, Watson, is not how a man prepares to study legal briefs. Either he was never meant to read them, or someone wanted it to seem that he had intended to." He turned now to Lestrade. "What do we know of the documents he was supposedly reviewing?" "Still locked inside the satchel," Lestrade replied. "We haven't opened it yet." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You haven't? Thought I'd wait for you. Commendable. Let us do so now." Lestrade produced a small key taken from Knox's effects and unlocked the brass clasp. The satchel creaked as it opened, revealing a stack of neatly bound folders, a leather notebook, and, Holmes drew it out with care, a sealed envelope. He inspected the envelope closely. Addressed to A.P. No surname. "Another lawyer?" I offered. "Possibly, but the seal is unbroken. Whoever A.P. is, they never received this." Holmes turned to the folder and opened the topmost file. Inside were pages of typed correspondence, legal arguments, contracts, and— He paused. An old case file marked Pendlebury versus Hargreaves, 1879. "Familiar to you?" Lestrade asked. "Not directly," Holmes murmured, flipping through. "But I recall the name Pendlebury, a land dispute in Surrey. Nothing to suggest murder. Yet why would Knox be revisiting a case nearly 20 years old?" He closed the folder and returned it to the bag. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the violet ink blot?" "Of course." Holmes led us to the writing desk. "Look here, on the underside of the blotter's lid." I lifted it carefully. There, faint but legible, was a reversed impression. Pendlebury knew. "Tell A.P. before Friday." Lestrade let out a low whistle. Holmes tapped the blot. "Written hastily, possibly under duress, but never delivered. Instead, Knox died seated in silence, never having penned the actual letter. "But how?" I began, then stopped. "Holmes, are you saying someone frightened him into silence?" "Not frightened," Holmes said softly. "Preempted." He turned back to the room, scanning every inch once more. His gaze caught on something near the far wall, just above the cabinet beneath the barred window. He strode over and knelt. "Ah, I thought so." He reached between the cabinet and the wall and retrieved a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw it was a fountain pen, sleek, silver-trimmed, and unmistakably stained at the tip with violet ink. "This," he said, holding it up to the light, "is not Knox's pen." Lestrade peered at it. "How do you know?" "Too fine, too modern." The secretary said Knox favored thick-nibbed fountain pens with broad strokes. "This one writes fine, fast, and sharp. A nervous writer, someone who—" Holmes trailed off. "Someone who came into the room after Knox?" I asked. "Or before," Holmes said grimly. The pen was dropped, abandoned, perhaps in haste. He held it to his nose and sniffed. "There. The scent, bergamot oil, perfumed, unusual for a legal clerk." "Possibly a woman?" I asked. Holmes gave me a glance. Not conclusive, but certainly a person with different habits than Knox. He wrapped the pen once more and tucked it into his coat. "Gentlemen," Holmes said, turning toward the door, "we are not merely solving the death of Archibald Knox. We are tracing the echo of a second presence, someone who meant to silence him, or at the very least, intercept his message." He paused. "Someone who may be planning to do it again." Lestrade straightened. "You think there will be another attempt?" Holmes gave a grim nod. "If this death was meant to protect a secret, then that secret remains under threat, and secrets, particularly legal ones, have a tendency to surface again, often at the wrong time." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Over the course of that damp and brooding afternoon, Holmes arranged a series of interviews with those connected, however distantly, to the late Mr. Archibald Knox. These encounters were not dramatic confrontations, nor did Holmes reveal his thoughts as they unfolded. Instead, he listened, and as he listened, I watched. Not the words spoken, but the way they were spoken, the glances, the hesitations, the faint tremors that passed like ghosts through each conversation. Our first visit took us to Mr. Howard Clegg, Knox's junior partner and protégé at the chambers of Clegg, Knox and Morton. A lean man with sand-colored hair and a voice too smooth to trust entirely, Clegg greeted us with cordial discomfort in his office, its walls lined with law books that appeared entirely untouched. "A tragic loss," he said, dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Archibald was a pillar, tireless, incorruptible. "And yet," Holmes remarked mildly, "he seems to have been revisiting a case long closed, Pendlebury vs. Hargreaves. Any notion why?" Clegg blinked rapidly. "Pendlebury? Lord, that's ancient history. Property case, boundary lines in Surrey. Very dry business." "Was Mr. Knox particularly invested in it?" "Not to my knowledge. He always preferred litigation to land disputes." "Might have been for reference." Holmes leaned back. "And the name AP, does it mean anything to you?" Clegg hesitated, eyes narrowing. "AP? No, should it?" Holmes only smiled. "Did Knox seem distressed lately?" I asked. Clegg folded his hands. "Now that you mention it. He was distracted this past week. Would forget things. Leave meetings early. It wasn't like him." Holmes stood, offering no further comment. "Thank you, Mr. Clegg. That will suffice." Our next call took us to the modest quarters of Miss Theodora Albright, Knox's personal secretary and longtime assistant. She received us in a sitting room filled with lace curtains and the faint aroma of ink and lemon oil. A thin woman of 35 with intelligent eyes and a reserved manner, Miss Albright appeared genuinely grieved. "I can't imagine the chambers without Mr. Knox," she said softly. "He was meticulous, gentle, even when cross." "You were the last person to speak with him," Holmes said. "He asked not to be disturbed." "Yes. He said he'd be working late in the archive, going through old files. He brought his satchel. He looked tired." "Tired?" Holmes repeated. She nodded. "And older, somehow. Like he was bearing something heavy." Holmes tilted his head. "Did he ever mention someone by the initials AP?" A flicker passed across her face. Very brief, but Holmes caught it. "No," she said quickly. "I don't think so. Do you recognize this pen?" Holmes produced the silver-nibbed fountain pen we'd found behind the filing cabinet. She took it gently, turning it over. "No, it's not his. He used a wide-nib Parker. This is finer, and it smells bergamot?" Holmes observed her keenly. "Unusual scent, wouldn't you say?" She returned the pen, avoiding his eyes. "Yes, for a legal office." Holmes gave a courteous bow. "One last thing, Miss Albright. Do you recall any visitors Mr. Knox met with privately in the past fortnight?" She hesitated. This pause was longer. He met someone last Thursday. A woman. I wasn't introduced. She came late in the day, stayed less than 10 minutes. Mr. Knox seemed agitated afterward." "Could you describe her?" "Not well. Medium height, dark coat, gloves. She wore a veil." "Did she leave her name?" "No, only that it was a personal matter." Holmes thanked her, then paused at the door. "If you recall anything else, no matter how minor, please send word to Baker Street." Miss Albright gave a quiet nod, eyes lowered. Later that evening, as gas lights flared against the thickening fog and the city curled into its evening hush, we arrived at the private residence of Mr. Lionel Morton, the senior partner of the firm. He received us in a large study lined with antique clocks, everyone ticking at a slightly different rhythm. The sound was maddening. Morton himself was stout and ruddy, with a voice like gravel and the slow, deliberate speech of a man who thought carefully before every word. "Knox's death has struck a blow, Mr. Holmes. A fine lawyer, if a touch self-righteous." "You say that with some conviction," Holmes noted. Morton poured himself a brandy. "Don't mistake me. I respected him, but he had a habit of revisiting old matters, dragging bones best left buried." "Such as Pendlebury versus Hargreaves?" Morton's face hardened. "You've seen the files, then?" "Yes, that one." "What was unusual about it?" Morton swirled his drink. "Let's just say the verdict wasn't entirely above board. A few hands were greased, nothing criminal, but questionable." "Was Knox aware of this?" "I believe he suspected. He never said as much, but he asked questions. Subtle ones. That was 20 years ago, mind you. And why revisit it now? I haven't the faintest idea. Unless—" He stopped himself. "Unless—" Morton stared into the fire. "Unless someone had threatened to expose it, or already had." Holmes raised his brow. "And who, in your mind, might be desperate enough to kill to prevent that?" Morton exhaled through his nose. "I'd be careful where that question leads, Mr. Holmes. Not all secrets are buried in graves. Some walk the halls wearing silk gloves." Holmes said nothing. But I saw the glint in his eye as we left. Something had shifted. Back at Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe and sat in the armchair with his fingers steepled. I could see the machine of his mind in motion, quiet, efficient, utterly relentless. "Well," I asked, "do we have our murderer?" "No," he replied. "What we have is a theater of masks." He ticked off names on his fingers. "Howard Clegg, evasive, too smooth, knows more than he says. Theodora Albright, nervous, hiding something, and then Morton, who admits corruption but suggests silence. Each with motive?" Not yet proven, but all with secrets, and all orbiting one man who was, for some reason, digging into the past. I leaned forward. Do you believe the mysterious veiled woman is the key? She may be, or she may be another decoy. But what troubles me most is this. Knox never opened the satchel. He never read the file. He came to the archive prepared, and yet did nothing, as though he knew he would not leave. Are you suggesting he anticipated his death? Holmes exhaled smoke. No, Watson. I believe he had been warned. Chapter 5. The Red Herring. The next morning brought with it a knock at the door and the unmistakable sharpness of Inspector Lestrade's voice echoing up the stairwell. I'd scarcely risen from my chair when Holmes called, "Enter," and the inspector appeared, flushed and triumphant, with a folded document in hand. "We've got him," he declared, eyes alight. "You'll be pleased to know, Holmes, that the case may not be so baffling after all." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. Whom have we caught?" Lestrade dropped the paper onto our table. Name of Peter Arkwright, clerk at the Chambers, disgruntled, recently dismissed. Holmes sat forward, steepling his fingers. Go on. Seems Knox sacked him a fortnight ago, caught him borrowing documents he shouldn't have had access to, legal drafts, client files. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make him look suspicious. Arkwright swore it was a misunderstanding. Then Knox was found dead, and guess who failed to report for work the very next morning? Holmes said nothing, so Lestrade pressed on. We brought him in, questioned him last night. Nervous, sweating, barely coherent. Claimed he had nothing to do with it, but couldn't give a proper alibi for the hours of the murder. Then we searched his flat. Found papers, Knox's papers, hidden in his desk drawer. Holmes leaned back. And the motive? Revenge, most likely. He was humiliated. Said Knox was going to report him to the Bar Council. Would have meant the end of his legal career. Did he have access to the archive room? Lestrade nodded. Used to do research runs for Knox. Knew the locks. I knew the routine. Could have slipped in and hidden behind the filing cabinets. Then, once Knox entered, he made a gesture mimicking a strike. I leaned forward. But there were no wounds on the body. Poison, perhaps, Lestrade said. Still waiting on the toxicology report. We're checking his flat for substances. Holmes stood and walked to the window, peering into the fog. And the satchel? The pen? The inkblot? Lestrade hesitated. Could all be part of it. Maybe Knox was about to expose something and Arkwright found out. Wanted to silence him before he could. Holmes turned. Inspector, I must commend your industriousness. You've built a perfectly coherent narrative, one that will please your superiors. Lestrade puffed out his chest. It'll be wrapped up by Friday. You'll see. Holmes nodded. Just one more question, then. Yes? Why was there no trace of Arkwright in the archive room? Lestrade blinked. Come again. No footprints, no fingerprints, no stray fibers, no scent of his tobacco. He smokes Virginia Twist, does he not? That smell lingers. Well, we hadn't noted? Because there was nothing to note, Holmes said. Knox's presence was clear, but Arkwright. Not so much as a scuff in the cabinet where someone might have hidden. No evidence he was ever in that room. Lestrade flushed. We've got the papers. He had a motive. Motives are like shadows. They follow many but belong to few. Holmes turned from the window. Still, let us not be hasty. May I speak with this Mr. Arkwright? Lestrade hesitated. He's still in holding. I suppose you could. Excellent. Watson, your coat. Scotland Yard's interview room was as stark and sallow as ever. Arkwright sat alone at a narrow table, his fingers twitching slightly as we entered. He was a wiry young man with pale skin, thinning hair, and a mouth that seemed always half-formed around a defensive word. Mr. Arkwright, Holmes began without introduction. You've found yourself in an unenviable position. I didn't kill him, Arkwright muttered. I didn't even see him that day. You took documents from your office. Why? Arkwright's eyes darted. They were mine, notes I'd compiled, cases I worked on. Yet one of those cases was Pendlebury versus Hargreaves. That stopped him. I didn't steal that one. I found it on Knox's desk the day I was sacked. He was looking into it. Said it concerned someone important. Someone with the initials AP? His face twitched. You found the letter then? Holmes tilted his head. So you knew about it? I read it, or tried to. I only saw a draft. Something about Pendlebury knowing something. Knox looked terrified. Did he confide in you? No, but he was shaking when he left the office that night, like he expected to be followed. Holmes studied him for a moment. Tell me, Mr. Arkwright, do you use a fountain pen? Arkwright looked confused. No, ballpoint, cheaper. Holmes gave a curt nod and turned to go. Thank you. That will be all. Outside the room, Lestrade looked irritated. So, still think he's innocent? I think, Holmes said carefully, that Mr. Arkwright may be a thief, but he is not a murderer. Lestrade scoffed. And what makes you so sure? Holmes turned to him. He doesn't write with a fountain pen. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes paced like a hound just short of catching the scent. I had never seen him more agitated in silence. He pulled volumes from his shelves, reviewed case files from years past, then discarded them with growing impatience. Holmes, I said cautiously, you believe this has nothing to do with Arkwright? No, he's a scapegoat. Convenient. He had a motive, yes, but not the method. He didn't know about the archive lamp, didn't understand the message in the ink, and most crucially, he isn't afraid. A killer is always afraid. I sat down across from him. Then who? Who are we really chasing? He paused at the window, hands behind his back. Someone patient. Someone who knew Knox's habits intimately. Someone who wanted a specific message buried before it reached its destination. The AP letter. Yes, but I no longer believe the letter was meant to expose just a land dispute. He turned slowly. Watson, how much do you know of the Pendlebury case? Only that it concerned land in Surrey. A border conflict. Holmes walked to his files and pulled out a thick, dust-covered volume. And do you know who represented Pendlebury in 1879? I shook my head. He opened the file and pointed. Archibald Knox, then a young barrister. I stood. You think this is a matter of guilt, that Knox was covering his own misdeeds? Not his own, someone else's. Someone he protected, then regretted. Holmes snapped the file shut. We must find AP, Watson, before the real killer realizes they haven't finished what they started. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. The fog hung low again that morning, as though the city itself wished to conceal something. Holmes sat with uncommon stillness at the breakfast table, his untouched toast going cold beside him. His gaze was fixed on a single sheet of paper, yellowed, creased, and scrawled with a signature I could not yet read from across the room. When I finally broke the silence by folding my newspaper, he looked up. Watson, he said quietly, this case is not just a murder. It is an inheritance. I blinked. An inheritance. He stood, holding the paper between two fingers. Not of money, but of consequence. A decision made 2 decades ago, improperly buried, and now exhumed with deadly results. I moved to his side. The document was a copy of court testimony, dated September 12, 1879, a signature at the bottom. A. Pendlebury. I reviewed Knox's original notes on Pendlebury versus Hargreaves. Holmes continued. Buried among his personal correspondence, filed under miscellaneous, was this affidavit. It was never submitted to court, just a personal copy. But note the final line. I read aloud. And should anything happen to me, let this statement be given to my niece, Amelia. Amelia Pendlebury, Holmes said, voice low. Initials, A.P. I looked at him, astonished. You think she's the one the letter was meant for? I'm certain of it. And what does the statement contain? Holmes tapped the paper. An allegation that the Hargreaves family used forged deeds to claim Pendlebury land. Knox, then a junior associate, discovered this just before the verdict, but instead of exposing it, he remained silent. I let out a breath. Why? Holmes gave a grim smile. Because he was advised to, pressured most likely by Morton. There's a margin note here in Knox's hand. Not worth the firm's future. Blackmail? I asked. Closer to legal complicity, but now, years later, Knox had grown troubled. Something or someone was urging him to revisit it. Miss Pendlebury. Holmes nodded. And someone else wanted it kept buried. He retrieved the fountain pen from the drawer, the one with the bergamot scent, and held it thoughtfully. Watson, I believe our murderer has already returned to the scene of the crime. More than once. You mean the pen wasn't dropped during the murder? Unlikely. It was wedged too neatly between the cabinet and wall. I suspect it was discarded afterward, during a staged inspection, as if someone returned to clean up and missed a spot. I stared. So the killer returned to ensure there were no clues, only to leave one behind. An irony I'm sure they now regret. He turned abruptly toward the door. We must locate Miss Amelia Pendlebury. If she holds the key to Knox's change of heart, then she is either the final witness or the next intended victim. It took only a few hours of inquiring through civil records and charitable trusts to discover that Amelia Pendlebury was not only living in London, but residing under a different name. Mrs. Amelia Price, a widow of modest means who worked with a legal literacy program for underprivileged women in Whitechapel. We found her at the community centre near Spittal Fields, a slender woman in her late 40s with silver-threaded hair and a posture both poised and cautious. Her eyes, a soft hazel, widened slightly when Holmes introduced himself. Miss Pendlebury, he began. I go by Price now, she said gently, though I imagine I know what you've come to ask. You received a letter from Mr. Knox? Her gaze lowered. No, I was expecting one. He promised when we last spoke that he would send something by week's end. It never came. You met recently. 10 days ago, she replied. At his request, he said he had uncovered something he should have revealed long ago. He seemed tormented. What did you speak of? She took a breath. He told me about the case. How my uncle had been wronged, how evidence was dismissed. He said he'd been a coward then, but that it was time to make it right. Did he name anyone responsible? Only vaguely. He said there were hands above him, people who protected the outcome. Did you tell anyone about this meeting? No, he asked me not to. I assumed he needed time to gather the documents. Holmes studied her carefully. Do you recall what pen he used to take notes? A wide-nibbed Parker. He mentioned it had belonged to his father. Holmes handed her the silver-nibbed pen. And this? She examined it, frowned. No, not his. This smells like a perfume. Would you say this was familiar to you? She turned it over slowly. Yes, she said at last. The woman I saw him with. My heart jumped. You saw someone else? She nodded. At the chambers. As I arrived, a woman was leaving. Dark coat, gloves, veiled hat. I caught only a glimpse, but she carried a slim silver pen, just like this. Could you describe her? Holmes asked. Not precisely, but she walked quickly, like she didn't want to be seen. Holmes took the pen back gently. Thank you, Mrs. Price. You may have just told us what we needed to know. Back at Baker Street, Holmes threw open the window, breathing deeply. "Well?" I asked. "She was followed," he said. "Mrs. Price?" "No, Knox, or perhaps both of them. The killer didn't just silence a man. They waited to see who else he might tell. That's why the letter was never delivered. That's why the archive lamp was moved, to give the illusion of study, not confession." He turned to me. The entire scene was crafted to look undisturbed, because it had been disturbed. I sat, stunned. "You mean the murder wasn't impromptu?" "It was prepared. Meticulously," Holmes said. "And now I know who moved the lamp." "Who?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the mantel and tapped a message tube into the pneumatic messenger. It was addressed to Miss Theodora Albright. "She will come," he said simply. "And when she does, we shall know." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. By the following morning, Baker Street had once again returned to its usual smoky rhythm. The distant clatter of hooves in the fog, the whistle of a distant train, and the scent of black Darjeeling wafting from the hearth. Yet there was an undercurrent to the air, a tension Holmes never named aloud, but which I had come to recognize as his quiet certainty that the storm was not over. He stood by the window, glancing occasionally at the clock on the mantel. "She's late," he murmured. "Miss Albright?" Holmes nodded. It is not in her nature to ignore a summons from me, especially one worded as provocatively as the one I sent. "What did you write?" "That the truth was close at hand, and I would appreciate the presence of the person who helped bury it." Before I could respond, the familiar sound of footsteps on the stairwell made him raise a finger. A knock. Holmes did not move, merely calling out, "Enter." The door creaked open, and Miss Theodora Albright stepped inside, framed by the grey morning light. She wore the same high-necked traveling coat as before, her gloved hands neatly folded in front of her. Yet there was a stiffness to her posture now, an edge behind her typically composed expression. "You sent for me," she said. "I did," Holmes replied, motioning to the chair by the fire. "Please." She sat slowly. I noted a tremor in her fingers as she removed her gloves. Barely visible, but present. "I assume this is about Knox," she said coolly. "Has there been a development?" Holmes picked up the silver pen from the mantelpiece, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "You used to carry this," he said. "A gift from your father, I believe." For the first time, Miss Albright's eyes narrowed. "Yes," she said, guarded. "Though I lost it some time ago." "Lost? Or left?" She met his gaze squarely. "Do you believe I was involved in Mr. Knox's death?" "I believe," said Holmes slowly, "that you were the last person to see him alive." A silence fell, thick, pressurized. At length, she drew in a breath. "I did go to see him, the day before he died." "Why?" "I had heard rumors that he was reviewing old cases. Digging up the past. Specifically, the Pendlebury matter." She hesitated. "Yes." "And that frightened you?" Her voice faltered slightly. "It concerned me. That case was a turning point for our firm. The outcome allowed Morton to expand rapidly, and it laid the groundwork for our rise. If it were to be reversed, the firm's reputation would collapse." Holmes finished. She nodded, slowly. "Exactly. I told Knox not to proceed, that it would destroy everything we had built." "Did you threaten him?" "No," she said firmly. "I asked him, I reasoned with him. He was distressed, and I left, believing he might relent." "But you returned," Holmes said softly. "Later." She shook her head. "No, I never went back." Holmes set the pen gently on the side table and said nothing more. Miss Albright took that as her cue and rose to leave. "If you uncover anything further," she said, her voice regaining its steadiness, "I hope you'll let me know." With that, she departed. We sat in silence until her footsteps vanished down the stairs. Holmes poured himself tea and stirred it absently. She's lying, of course. I gathered as much. But not about everything, he added. She did meet Knox. She did try to dissuade him. But what she's hiding is what she saw when she returned. I blinked. So she did return. She must have, Holmes said. The pen, her perfume, her proximity to the scene. But if she didn't kill Knox, she may have seen who did. Why not say so? Because doing so implicates her. The timing, the concealment of her visit, it all aligns too closely with the murder. She may be innocent of the crime, but not of its circumstances. That afternoon, we received word from Inspector Lestrade, who had returned to the Knox chambers with a forensic clerk to review any missed evidence. He summoned us to Lincoln's Inn with unusual urgency. When we arrived, Lestrade led us not into Knox's office, but into the neighboring one, until then sealed for renovations. "There's something you need to see," he said, gesturing toward the interior. Holmes stepped through, and at once his face grew taut with focus. I followed him inside. It was a dusty, stripped-down chamber with cracked plaster and boards across the windows. But in the corner was a large, dented filing cabinet, one of its drawers forced open violently. A small patch of dark staining was visible beneath it. "Blood?" I asked. Lestrade nodded. "Dried, but consistent with Knox's blood type. We believe he might have been attacked here, not in his own office." Holmes knelt and examined the floor. "There are drag marks," he observed. "The body was moved." "Precisely," said Lestrade. "Knox didn't die where we found him. The killer murdered him here, then staged the scene in his office." Holmes stood slowly. "And that changes everything." "Why?" "Because it means the killer was not simply reacting in panic. They had time, enough time to lift a dead man and lay him out precisely, which suggests two things: physical strength or an accomplice." I felt a chill. Holmes ran his fingers along the rim of the drawer, and this was what they wanted. He pulled out a single torn folder, scorched at the edges. Inside was a list of old client records. One name jumped out: Hargreaves via Pendlebury, 1879. Holmes pocketed it. "The real reason for Knox's murder is not guilt or morality. It's evidence. Someone needed this destroyed, permanently." "And yet they missed it," I said. He smiled faintly. "People in a hurry always miss something." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the damaged folder on the table and examined it under the gas lamp. There was a second sheet stuck to the back, charred but still legible. A signature, faint but clear: W. Morton. "Morton himself intervened?" I asked. Holmes didn't reply immediately. He stared at the signature, then reached for his pipe. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe this murder was not committed out of rage or panic, but strategy." He exhaled smoke, eyes narrowing. "And our murderer may have killed once before." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The following day dawned thick with fog, coiling along Baker Street like a living thing. Holmes, who had slept little and spoken even less since our discovery in the adjoining office, now stood before the fireplace, lost in a posture of brooding stillness. His violin untouched, his pipe unsmoked. I had seen this kind of silence before. It was not idleness, but a storm gathering in the recesses of his mind. "We must agitate the nest," he said at last. "Agitate?" He turned to me, eyes bright with purpose. "The murderer operates under the assumption that the truth lies buried with Knox. But what if they believed otherwise? What if they feared someone else knew?" "You mean Miss Albright?" "No. She's already afraid. And with good reason. But there are others in Morton and Albright who may have a stake in this puzzle, whether through complicity, silence, or something else altogether." I raised an eyebrow. "You suspect Morton?" "Suspect? No. but I intend to make him think I do." He crossed the room to his writing desk and, with surgical precision, began penning 3 notes, each brief, sealed in wax, and addressed to a different name. Mr. William Morton, Miss Theodora Albright, and Mr. Arthur Norridge, the junior solicitor who had been in the periphery of our first meeting at the firm. Holmes handed them to me. "Have these delivered by hand. No footman, no delay. I want them unsettled before the day is out." I glanced at the wax stamps. Each bore the initials S.H., though the parchment was left unsigned. The contents, I assumed, were deliberately vague. "They'll come to us?" "They must," Holmes said, "if only to ask what I know." By midday, all 3 recipients had replied, with varying degrees of eagerness. Miss Albright sent a terse note requesting a second meeting on her terms. Norridge replied with surprising alacrity, asking if Holmes preferred tea or port. Morton himself, ever the statesman, arrived unannounced. The door burst open without a knock, and Mr. Morton strode in, removing his gloves with a certain theatrical severity. "You've been busy, Mr. Holmes," he said, "and, unless I misjudge the matter, dangerously close to libel." Holmes gestured to the armchair. "Please do sit. Your reputation has little to fear from me, so long as your hands are clean. I don't care for riddles. No? Then I fear you'll find this entire affair disagreeable." Morton sat, brushing dust from his coat sleeve. His mouth was drawn in a tight line, but there was a tremor behind his eyes. Holmes tilted his head. "I find it curious, Mr. Morton, that Mr. Knox, just before his death, had requested access to files long presumed destroyed, specifically those concerning the Hargreaves versus Pendlebury case. Would you care to comment?" Morton's brow furrowed. "That case was a miscarriage of justice," he said flatly. "One we tried for years to correct, until our client passed away and the court dismissed all pending appeals. Knox believed otherwise, but he was chasing ghosts." "Ghosts have a habit of speaking when one least expects them," Holmes replied. "I won't dignify this performance with further comment," Morton said, rising. "But let me be clear. If you drag this firm's name through the mud in pursuit of some self-serving fantasy, I will see to it that you are discredited in every professional circle that matters." "An ambitious threat," Holmes replied, without looking up. "One might think you had something to lose." Morton paused only briefly at the door. "Don't make enemies you don't understand, Mr. Holmes." Then he was gone. Later that afternoon, Miss Albright returned, this time with less polish and far more urgency. Her composure had worn thin. The stiff, proper lines of her attire only highlighted the pallor beneath her cheeks. "I'm being watched," she said, voice low. Holmes motioned her to the armchair. "Describe them." "I can't. Not clearly. A man in a coat lingering near my flat. 2 nights in a row. Last night, someone knocked and vanished. I told the constable. They said it was a coincidence." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Someone wants you unsettled." "I'm not safe, am I?" "No," Holmes said bluntly, "but not for the reasons you fear." She looked away, her fingers ringing in her lap. "I should have come clean," she murmured. "The night I returned to Knox's office, I found the door ajar. He was already dead. I didn't know what to do. I left." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did you see anyone else? Hear anything?" "A perfume," she said, frowning. "Not mine. Jasmine, I think. And the sound of something being dragged." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Dragged?" She nodded. "I thought it was furniture at the time. But it may have been him." As dusk began to descend, our final guest arrived, young Mr. Arthur Norridge, whom I had dismissed as an affable nonentity on our first visit, but now entering with stiff limbs and darting eyes. He seemed altogether changed. "Mr. Holmes," he said, bowing slightly, "this is quite the honor." Holmes, ever cordial, gestured to the sofa. "You were Mr. Knox's assistant, were you not?" "Yes, in his later years. Brilliant man, but troubled. He'd been obsessing over the Pendlebury case again." "And did he confide in you?" "To a degree. He was trying to track down an original deposition, one missing from the archives. Said it was the keystone." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Do you know who had access to that file?" Norwich swallowed. "Only 4 people. Mr. Morton, Miss Albright, Knox himself, and me." "And is it missing?" "Yes. I checked 2 days ago. It's gone." "Did you tell anyone?" He hesitated. No, I feared being blamed, but—" "Mr. Holmes, if you think I should— do you believe I'm in danger?" Holmes's reply was cryptic. "Not yet." Norwich's face paled visibly. Once he had gone, Holmes turned to me. "Here's our reaction." "You think it's Norwich?" "No," Holmes said. "But someone thinks he knows something, and now they'll come for him." He stood, reaching for his coat. "We must get ahead of the killer. Tonight we shadow Mr. Norwich." "Shadow him?" "Yes. If the murderer believes he's holding a missing piece of the puzzle, they'll make a move." He turned to me, his voice low and urgent. "And Watson, we must let them." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The night was unusually still, a tense, breathless quiet that seemed to stretch taut over the London rooftops. From our vantage point across the narrow mews on Mortimer Street, Holmes and I kept our watch on the dimly lit second-story window of Mr. Barstaby, Arthur Norwich's modest bachelor flat. Holmes had brought no weapon, only his slender cane and a pair of field glasses, which he used intermittently with sharp, calculating glances. I, for my part, clutched my revolver, having learned the hard way that Holmes's cases had a tendency to end with sudden violence. "He's nervous," Holmes murmured. I followed his gaze. Norwich's silhouette paced back and forth behind the curtains, pausing occasionally to peer out as though he suspected he was being watched. "He should be," I said. "You told him someone would make a move tonight." "I told him the truth, or just enough of it." "Do you truly believe he's in danger?" Holmes turned slightly toward me, his face half lost in the shadows. "The missing deposition, that is the key. Someone believes Norwich has it, or worse, that he's seen what it contains. And when men believe their secrets are slipping beyond their control, they grow reckless, even murderous." The fog rolled in thicker by the hour, clinging to the lamplight like old gauze. Down below, the gas lights hissed against the mist, casting a dull amber glow on the cobbles. Time dragged slowly. Midnight struck with a weary chime from a distant tower, and still nothing stirred. Then Holmes raised his hand. From the far end of the street a shape emerged from the mist. It was a figure cloaked in a dark coat, moving not with the aimless steps of a drunkard or the meandering pace of a passer-by, but with the slow, deliberate poise of someone on a mission. "Watch the timing," Holmes whispered. The figure paused at the corner, looked up at Norwich's building, then disappeared into the alley that wrapped behind it. Holmes was already on his feet. "Come, Watson." We moved quickly, yet without haste, circling down the stairwell and slipping into the fog. Holmes led us behind the row of houses, past crates and crates of stacked coal and wet refuse, until we crouched beneath the iron fire escape outside Norwich's flat. A faint click broke the silence. Metal meeting metal. "Lockpick," Holmes murmured. "Fast. Professional." I tightened my grip on the revolver. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small mirrored disc. Holding it just right, he angled it upward toward the second-story window. The reflection captured a distorted image, enough to see the figure easing the sash open and slipping inside. "He's in. Do we wait?" Holmes's eyes were icy and unreadable. "For just a moment." Minutes passed like slow dripping water. Then we heard it, a muffled cry, cut short. Holmes moved. We raced up the fire escape, his long legs 2 steps ahead of mine until we reached the window. Holmes slipped his cane into the gap and lifted the sash. We entered the room as silent as phantoms. Inside, the flat was in chaos. Papers scattered, drawers open, and Arthur Norwich sprawled on the floor, a bloodied gash across his temple. Standing over him was a figure masked by a scarf and cap, caught in the act of rifling through a leather-bound folio. "Stop right there," I shouted, raising my revolver. The intruder bolted, diving through the open window and leaping to the fire escape below. Holmes was after him in an instant, sliding down the railing with dangerous speed. I rushed to Norwich's side, confirmed he was breathing, and then followed. The chase was fast and frantic. Through the fog-choked alleys, past startled horses and sleeping beggars, Holmes pursued with uncanny precision, dodging crates, leaping barrels, until finally, near a rusted gate by a tannery wall, he lunged forward and tackled the figure to the ground. The man struggled, swinging wildly, but Holmes pinned him with a force that belied his slender frame. I arrived seconds later, revolver still drawn. Holmes pulled the cap from the man's head, revealing a sharp-nosed, middle-aged man with graying whiskers and a look of feral desperation in his eyes. "Well, well," Holmes said coolly. "Mr. Edwin Letts, clerk and archivist at Morton and Albright." I blinked. "I know that name. He was Knox's assistant before Norwich, wasn't he?" Holmes nodded. "And conveniently forgotten in the firm's current roster. How very clever of you, Mr. Letts, slipping in under the radar, making yourself invisible." Letts snarled. "I want a solicitor." Holmes leaned in. "You'll need one. Attempted murder, breaking and entering, destruction of evidence. And if I'm correct—" "You're not," Letts snapped. "You don't know anything." "Oh, but I do," Holmes said, his voice dropping. "You followed Knox that night. You waited until the office was empty. You knew about the deposition. Knew it could destroy you." Letts said nothing, but the slight twitch of his jaw was enough for Holmes. He stood. "Watson, please see Norwich. Our friend here will accompany me to the yard." We returned to the flat once the constables had secured Letts in their custody. Norwich, dazed and bruised, now sat upright on the divan with a wet cloth pressed to his head. "I didn't even hear him come in," he muttered. "He was just there, rummaging through my desk." Holmes knelt beside him. "Did he take anything?" Norwich blinked. "No, nothing was missing. I don't even have the file. I told you it was gone." Holmes smiled faintly, but he didn't know that. "Letts thought Knox had entrusted it to you, that you might leak it. He struck in desperation, hoping to retrieve what he couldn't afford to lose." I glanced at Holmes, but what was in the missing deposition? Holmes rose. "That, dear Watson, is the last piece of the puzzle, and I dare say we're very close to finding it." As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the door, casting one final look at the shaken young man behind us. "You were brave, Mr. Norwich," he said gently. "But keep your door locked tonight." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The morning after the attack on Mr. Arthur, Norwich dawned grey and wet, with a low drizzle seeping into the very bones of the city. The mist clung to the streets, softening the edges of brick and lamplight. London, as Holmes often said, wore a mask best suited to deception in weather like this. At Baker Street, Holmes stood before the hearth, a curl of smoke rising from his pipe as he gazed into the fire with the vacant look he only adopted when his mind was at its sharpest. Inspector Lestrade sat rigidly in the armchair across from him, his hat clutched in his lap, clearly uncomfortable with Holmes's silence. "You've got Letts in custody," Holmes said at last, without looking away from the flames. "That should satisfy the yard for now." "For now, yes," Lestrade replied. "He won't speak, though. Denies everything. Claims he was never near Norwich's flat. Says he was with his brother in Bermondsey all night." "And the brother will corroborate it, of course." Lestrade scowled. Naturally. Holmes turned from the fire and began to pace. Letts is lying, and you know it. We think he's lying, but without proof. There is proof, Holmes interrupted. You simply haven't seen it yet. Letts made a mistake. What mistake? Holmes paused by the window, his eyes narrowing at something far beyond the fogged glass. He believed the deposition was still in play. He believed Knox had passed it to Norwich, or someone else in the firm, or even sent it away, but Letts' real mistake was assuming Knox had time. I spoke for the first time since Lestrade's arrival. You think Knox was killed before he could do anything with the document? Precisely. Letts believed he was racing against a deadline. In truth, the deed had already been done. But Holmes, I said, if the deposition never left Knox's possession, where is it now? Holmes looked at me with a gleam in his eye. That, Watson, is the right question. He moved swiftly to the desk and unrolled a series of papers, floor plans and architectural sketches I hadn't seen before. They bore the mark of a surveying firm, and one sheet, I noted, was a blueprint of the Morton and Albright offices. When did you obtain these? I asked, astonished. Late last night, while you were tending to poor Mr. Norwich. I visited the city archives. The building has undergone 3 renovations in the last 20 years, most recently in 1897. The upper mezzanine was added then, converting the old records room into 2 smaller offices. Holmes traced a finger across the drawing. Knox's office sits atop what was once a deep document vault. When the building was renovated, that vault was sealed, not removed, merely concealed behind the false paneling. He looked up. The deposition may still be there. Lestrade leaned forward. That's pure guesswork. No, Holmes said quietly. It's a deduction based on human nature. Knox was a cautious man, and if he feared what he'd discovered, he would not have trusted anyone else with it. He'd have hidden it until he could decide how to act. Letts must have discovered this, perhaps even helped build the vault when he worked there. But he never found the panel again. Or if he did, he couldn't risk breaking in during the day. Lestrade rubbed his forehead. This is all very clever, Holmes, but even if the document is there, what does it actually say? What makes it worth murder? Holmes's gaze turned hard. That, Inspector, is what we're going to find out. Tonight. That evening, under the pretense of conducting an inspection for fire risk compliance, Lestrade arranged access to the Morton and Albright offices after hours. With Holmes, myself, and 2 of his most discreet men, we entered the building at 10:30. The offices were dimly lit by gaslight, and the silence was so deep I could hear the tick of the wall clock above Knox's former desk. Holmes wasted no time. He moved with mechanical precision, tapping at the wood paneling with the handle of his cane, feeling for resonance and minute differences in sound. There, he said suddenly. He knelt by a section of wall just beneath the bookshelves and pressed at a series of knots in the wood. A faint click. With a low creak, a segment of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow recess behind. Inside, amid a gathering of cobwebs and dust, sat a flat iron box, locked and sealed with a rusted clasp. Holmes retrieved it carefully, setting it on the desk and breaking the seal with a penknife. The box contained only a few items: 2 folded letters, a small leather-bound notebook, and a single legal envelope. Holmes opened the notebook and scanned its contents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "What is it?" I asked. He passed me the envelope, which I opened. Inside was a handwritten deposition signed and witnessed. As I read, a chill settled over me. "It's a confession," I murmured, "from a man named Harold Sedgwick. He admits to fraud, yes, but also coercion, threats, bribery. He names others, including Letts." Lestrade leaned in. "Good Lord, he names members of Parliament." "And more," Holmes said grimly. Financial blackmail tied to trade deals, forgery of legal documents, falsification of contracts. Sedgwick was a civil servant in 1890, low-ranking but with access to internal communications. It appears he feared for his life when he wrote this. "He gave it to Knox?" Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded. They were distant cousins. Knox was perhaps the only man Sedgwick believed might one day reveal the truth. "Where is Sedgwick now?" "Dead. 10 years ago. Officially an accident." Lestrade's face was pale. This will cause a scandal." Holmes gave a short laugh. "That, I expect, is the least of your worries. But your duty, Inspector, is not to avoid scandal. It is to uphold the truth." He turned to me. "Watson, this case was never about a single murder. It was always about what that murder concealed." Chapter 11. The Bait Holmes Grand Strategy. Holmes always came alive when setting a trap. There was a glint in his eye, a slight sharpening of the voice, as if each gesture was part of a quiet orchestration only he could hear. "You've often said, Watson," he remarked the next morning over toast and a single boiled egg, "that truth is the destination, but to me, it is the path that matters, and in this case, we've reached a very narrow part of that path." "You mean we've identified the mastermind?" I asked. "No, not quite. But we've rattled his cage." Holmes had spent the early hours copying the pages of Sedgwick's deposition by hand. The original remained locked in a concealed drawer beneath the floorboards of 221B. What he held now was an almost exact replica, save for a few careful omissions. "I want them to believe the document is incomplete," he said. "Just enough truth to cause panic, but enough missing to draw them out." "And how will we deliver it?" Holmes smiled. "Ah, Watson, that is where you come in." I nearly dropped my fork. "Me? You shall play the part of the unsuspecting courier. A letter, supposedly meant for legal deposit, has gone astray. A trail is established, one which they must follow. Desperation, my friend, is the surest revealer of guilt." By noon, the game was set in motion. A parcel addressed to the offices of the Times was accidentally misdelivered to a Mr. Edwin Vance, a solicitor whose name had appeared briefly in Sedgwick's notes. The package was hand-delivered by a hired boy instructed to mention my name and give the impression it had passed through several hands. Holmes had calculated that this act would travel through the shadowed networks that still buzzed beneath the city's respectable face. We needed the reaction, not the reach. Lestrade, now fully convinced of the wider conspiracy, stationed 2 plainclothes men outside Vance's chambers and another near Let's known haunts. Holmes himself vanished entirely by early afternoon, instructing me only to remain at Baker Street and observe the breeze for signs of the storm. I did as he asked, though my nerves were not made for passive waiting. The long hours of that grey London day passed in slow, tedious increments. The silence of the flat was broken only by the clinking of the clock and the low grumble of distant carts. At 4:30, a knock. It was Holmes. He swept into the room, raindrops clinging to his collar, the scent of alleyways and cold iron following him in. "Well?" I asked, leaping up. It worked. He flung his coat to the hook and tossed a folded sheet of paper onto the table. It was a telegram, sent from an anonymous wire office in Belgravia. It read, "Package intercepted. He knows. Remove him tonight. Delay no longer." Holmes tapped the telegram with a long finger. "Intercepted by Lestrade's man. It was meant for Letts, or possibly someone even higher. They've taken the bait." He turned toward the fireplace and lit his pipe. "Tonight, Watson, we draw them out. If my theory is correct, someone far more dangerous than Letts will make their move. And we shall be watching." That evening, we returned to the Morton and Albright building, this time with even greater secrecy. Lestrade and 2 of his men were stationed discreetly across the street, while Holmes and I occupied Knox's office, the room dimly lit by a single lantern. Holmes stood at the window, the copy of the deposition visibly displayed on the desk behind him, framed as if it had just been discovered anew. A faint draught moved through the cracks of the old woodwork. "I've left the rear entrance unlocked," Holmes whispered. "They'll try to come quietly." As midnight approached, the building remained still. Then at 12:05, a soft creak. Holmes tensed. Footsteps. Careful, deliberate. The sound of gloves against wood. The door handle turned. We remained in shadow as the door opened, and a figure stepped inside, hooded, gloved, small of frame. Not Letts. The intruder moved toward the desk, unaware of our presence. Holmes struck a match. The flare lit the room. "I'd advise you not to touch that document," he said coolly. The intruder froze. A woman's voice. "You..." Holmes stepped forward. "Miss Claudia Morton, I presume." The face beneath the hood belonged to the senior partner's own daughter, sharp-eyed, cold, and unflinching. Holmes gestured toward the door. "You've played your part admirably. Now let's see how far the deception truly goes." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the desk clock and the steady breath of Claudia Morton, who stood as still as a wax figure in the doorway. The flickering lamplight carved shadows across her face, revealing not fear, but something colder, defiance. Holmes took a single step forward, folding his hands behind his back. "You chose an odd hour for family visits, Miss Morton." "I assume this is entrapment," she said, her voice calm and clipped. "Or does Scotland Yard now specialize in theatrics?" Watson moved to block the exit. I could feel the tension rising, not from her movements, but from Holmes. His face had shifted just subtly, as if something in her presence had recalibrated his thinking mid-course. "I wonder," Holmes said softly, "what a respected solicitor's daughter is doing retrieving falsified documents from a partner's desk, especially when said documents pertain to a man who died under suspicious circumstances only days ago." Claudia crossed her arms. "You already suspect me of some grand conspiracy, I presume. Why bother with the performance?" Holmes didn't smile. "Because you were not my initial suspect." That caught her. She blinked just once, but it was enough. Holmes had noted the momentary lapse. "You've been hiding in plain sight," he continued. "When Mr. Knox and his partners were tangled in deceit, you, efficient, unassuming, remained invisible. Even your father doesn't see you, but I suspect you see everything." She turned her eyes away. "I found correspondence in your father's personal files," Holmes went on. "Signed by Letts, requesting revisions to an estate portfolio. Signed on dates that aligned suspiciously with Mr. Sedgwick's complaints. And then there's the name used at the wire office, Clara Morton. A nearly perfect anagram of Claudia Morton." "Sloppy." "I had nothing to do with Sedgwick's death," she said, a tremor now threading her tone. Holmes nodded. "Perhaps not directly. But someone used you. Someone clever. You've been feeding information, yes? Misleading inquiries, shaping the path others take while staying just outside the circle of suspicion. But the pattern of influence, that tells its own story." Claudia's lips parted slightly. Then, in a low voice, she said, "You don't understand." Holmes tilted his head. "Then help me." She looked at the document still lying open on the desk, its false gaps now apparent. "He promised to save the firm," she whispered. "Said there were too many liabilities, too many secrets left by the old partners. Knox was already folding, gambling debts, failed mergers. Letts. He approached me after my father's heart attack. Said he could restructure the firm, bury what needed burying. And what did he ask for in return? Access, she said simply. Nothing more. Information about clients, documents before they reached the other partners. I never gave him money, never touched the deaths. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Deaths? Plural. She froze. There were others, I asked. Aside from Sedgwick? Claudia nodded slowly. There was a man named Graves, another client who had disputed one of Lett's acquisitions. He died of a so-called natural seizure 2 months ago. I didn't see it then, but now. Holmes turned away, staring into the shadows. The pattern stretches further than we thought, he murmured. Morton and Albright was merely the shell. The rot has deeper roots. But I didn't kill anyone, Claudia said, her voice trembling now. I swear to you, I only passed on names. I thought I was protecting my father's legacy. Holmes regarded her for a long, unreadable moment. You were useful, he said quietly, and that makes you dangerous. But not, I think, the architect. She looked relieved, but only for a second. From the hallway came the creak of a floorboard. Holmes raised his hand for silence. Then, a sudden sound, the soft click of metal against glass. Smoke. A canister rolled gently into the room, hissing as a pale mist began to curl up from its sides. Claudia screamed. Holmes acted swiftly, grabbing Watson by the sleeve. Out the window, quickly! We helped Claudia over the desk and pushed open the sash, escaping onto the rear fire escape as smoke thickened behind us. As we descended into the alley below, Holmes muttered, "They're tying off loose ends." Whoever she served, he knows she's no longer silent. I glanced at Claudia, coughing but alive, her eyes wide with terror. Holmes exhaled. The trap was mine, but the counterstroke, that was his. And he is no amateur. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The morning that followed was grey and breathless, with London shrouded in a low mist that hugged the cobbled streets like mourning cloth. The events of the previous night still hung in the air. Claudia Morton's confession, the desperate gas attack, and the unmistakable scent of someone sweeping the board clean before Holmes could checkmate the game. We found temporary refuge in a small private lodging in Marylebone arranged by Mycroft, silent, secure, and unlikely to be traced. Claudia sat wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace, silent since dawn, save for brief and trembling affirmations. She had seen the face of the man who deployed the canister, but the smoke had obscured details. A gloved hand, a tall frame, eyes sharp behind a scarf. Nothing Holmes could act upon, and yet something burned behind his gaze as he paced the room in long, thoughtful strides. He tried to erase her, Holmes muttered aloud. Not threatened, not frightened. Erase. He, I echoed. You're sure it was a man? Holmes nodded. Yes, Watson. No hired thug would have handled it so cleanly. The timing, the placement, it was surgical. It was personal. I turned to Claudia. Do you believe Mr. Letts orchestrated the attack? She looked at us with glassy eyes. I don't know. I think he's capable of it. But I never met anyone else. He kept the connection veiled. Holmes tapped a finger against his lips. Then he is not alone in this. He may be the strategist, but not the executioner. That man last night, he was something colder, not burdened with motive, only mission. Holmes halted at the window, staring out into the mist. He will act again. He must. Why? I asked. Because Claudia has not vanished, he replied calmly. She is a witness who lives, breathes, and now can speak. And that makes her the thread that will unravel the entire cloth. If I were him, I would make one final attempt. Bold, theatrical, irreversible. Just then, a sharp knock rang out through the silence of the house. We froze. Another knock. Firm. Measured. 3 slow raps. Holmes motioned to me silently, then reached into the folds of his coat. A small revolver, previously unseen, glinted dully in his palm. He approached the door carefully and tilted his head to listen, Then, with one swift motion, he yanked the door open. A young constable stood there, uniform immaculate, cap tucked under one arm. "Mr. Holmes?" "Yes," Holmes said slowly. "Inspector Lestrade sent me. There's been a development at Let's residence, an explosion. Fire brigade is on site. He thought you should see it at once." Holmes studied him for a long, unsettling moment. "You're new to Lestrade's team?" he asked. "Transferred from Kent, sir." Holmes nodded slowly. "Tell Inspector Lestrade we'll arrive shortly. He'll understand." The man blinked, confused. "Of course, sir." He turned and disappeared down the steps. As soon as the door closed, Holmes spun to Claudia. "Stay here. Watson, you're with me." "But why didn't you—" "He's lying," Holmes said flatly. Lestrade wouldn't have sent a man without credentials. No badge, no identification, no soot on his coat, no urgency in his step. And if there had truly been an explosion, all of London would be echoing with bells and shouts by now. Then he came to scout the house, confirm our presence. Perhaps more. If he had seen an opportunity, he might have taken it. We descended the fire escape and hailed a cab from the alley. As we rattled toward Let's address, not to confirm the lie, but to learn what had really happened, Holmes turned to me, his voice tight and low. "Watson, the pieces are shifting rapidly. Claudia is no longer the target. I am." "You?" "They know I'm closing in. They need to end the game before I complete the board." "And you intend to let them try?" He glanced at me with a faint smile. "No, my dear fellow," he said. "I intend to beat them at their own game." The cab turned the corner, and for a moment the mist lifted. Let's estate came into view. There were no flames, no smoke, no officers, only silence. Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "This was never about cleaning the crime," he murmured. "It was about luring us out." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed, the facade of the Letts estate loomed before us like a stage with its curtains drawn. No scent of smoke lingered in the morning air, nor did any fire brigade surround the perimeter. The false message had done its work, attempted to draw Holmes into a trap. Yet the snare had snapped too soon. Holmes remained still in the cab, observing. "There," he murmured, pointing with his cane, not toward the front steps, but to a carriage parked half a block down. It sat unnaturally still, horses calm, the driver absent. "Someone's watching," he whispered, "watching and waiting to see if we took the bait." Before I could reply, he opened the door. "Come, Watson, we mustn't disappoint them entirely." We crossed the street casually, feigning aimlessness, as though simply passing the time. Holmes let his gaze drift across the estate's shutters and window frames, eyes trained yet unfocused in appearance. We didn't enter. That, I knew now, was not his intention. We walked on, past the house and further down the lane as if losing interest. Only when we turned the corner did Holmes speak again. "They knew Claudia was a weak link," he said quietly. "But they failed to account for one thing." "What's that?" "Me." I raised an eyebrow. "Forgive me, Holmes, but you are precisely who they were accounting for." "Ah," he replied with a trace of amusement. "Then allow me to rephrase. They accounted for my presence, but not my memory." Holmes hailed another cab and gave a sudden address. Not to Scotland Yard, not to the boarding house, but to Finch's antique bookstore. "You believe Finch holds the key?" I asked as the carriage jolted forward. "I believe Finch gave it away without realizing, and it was I who nearly missed it." Moments later, we stood once more within the dusty, incense-laced shop of Mr. Finch, who looked up from his ledger with some surprise. "Back so soon, Mr. Holmes?" "Indeed. I have a matter most urgent. You told me previously that Mr. Letts had visited you on 2 occasions, the second time in haste, and the first? When?" Finch blinked. "Why, several weeks before the fire, sir. He purchased that black lacquered box from the Japanese shelf. Holmes nodded. Did he say what it was for? Not precisely, though he seemed quite focused on the false compartment. Watson and I exchanged glances. False compartment? I asked. Finch chuckled. Oh, yes. A clever little thing. Slides open only if you press a notch beneath the hinge. That's why it fetched such a price. Holmes stepped forward, his voice tightening. And you're certain he understood how to access the compartment? I showed him myself. Holmes nodded. That box survived the fire? Finch blinked. Why, no. It wasn't in the debris. We stepped out into the London streets, and Holmes pressed a hand to his brow. I've been a fool, he murmured. The puzzle wasn't the message. It was the medium. The box? Yes, Watson. Claudia said the puzzle was meant as a token, but Letts never intended it as such. It was a vessel, a ruse. The true message wasn't the cipher she was given. It was the contents of that false compartment. Likely a document, a letter, perhaps a confession. Confession? To what, we do not yet know. But Letts destroyed his home soon after acquiring that box, didn't he? And the only item he took great care to retrieve, according to Claudia, was that very box. That detail, Watson, is the final thread. We returned to Baker Street under cover of dusk. Claudia remained in the secure lodging, guarded now by a trusted associate of Mycroft. Holmes worked in silence through the evening. He laid out sketches, timelines, and witness statements in a wide arc across our sitting room. I dared not interrupt him. Then, just past midnight, he straightened. It was never about blackmail, he said, nor about inheritance or social ruin. This began with betrayal, an ancient one. What betrayal? Holmes turned to me, his gaze flaring with triumph and sorrow. Letts was never working alone, and the man behind the gas attack, the one who orchestrated the entire deception, is a name we've heard before, not in this case, but in another. He tapped a finger against the corner of the newspaper clipping, and when I leaned closer, my breath caught. It was the name of a man we had presumed dead. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was an evening thick with fog, the sort that blurred lamp-posts into halos and turned the cobbled streets of London into a sea of soft grey whispers. Within the drawing-room of the Letts estate, restored since the fire but still scarred by its memory, a curious ensemble had gathered at Holmes's bidding. Claudia sat closest to the hearth, her gloved hands folded in her lap, nerves betraying themselves in the faint tapping of her heel against the floor. Finch had arrived earlier, pretending surprise at the invitation, though his eyes never stopped scanning the room, cataloguing each face. Lestrade stood to one side, arms crossed, his expression half impatience, half intrigue. And behind them all, half in shadow, loomed Gregory Mellis, the cousin. Holmes, with his customary calm, presided over the room like a conductor awaiting the downbeat. I stood by the sideboard, pretending to inspect a decanter, though my eyes too were trained on Mellis. Holmes cleared his throat. You may be wondering why I've called you all here, or perhaps you've guessed. I suspect, Lestrade said, that you mean to finally name your man. Indeed. But before I do, allow me to lay before you the tapestry of this affair, a tale not merely of murder, but of memory, of actions taken years ago that only now demand their price. Finch scoffed. Must we dramatize, Mr. Holmes? A man is dead and a girl nearly burned alive. Surely that is drama enough. Holmes turned to him. You played your part, Mr. Finch. Perhaps not knowingly, but certainly willingly. Finch went pale, but said nothing. Holmes stepped forward. We know that Arthur Letts visited you to purchase a Japanese puzzle box. Not for sentiment, but for its secret compartment. You say you showed him how to open it, and shortly after, he returned home and burned it to the ground. Holmes turned. Claudia, you mentioned he removed only a single item before the fire. She nodded. Yes, he was cradling the box as if it were fragile, or sacred. Exactly, because it contained something dangerous. A document, most likely. Something written years ago. A confession, perhaps. A letter. Proof of betrayal. Watson leaned forward. But whose betrayal? Holmes's gaze drifted to Mellis. 20 years ago, he said, Arthur Letts was engaged in a business venture, an overseas contract in Egypt involving rare antiquities. He went with a partner. That partner died. Or so we believed. Mellis stiffened. Holmes continued. In truth, the partner vanished, took the investment funds and fled. Letts returned ruined, publicly disgraced. Yet he never exposed the betrayal. Why? Perhaps guilt. Perhaps love. Lestrade frowned. Are you saying Mellis faked his own death? Not faked, Holmes replied. Misreported. A convenient sandstorm, a body too damaged for certainty. Letts knew, and he kept the secret. For Claudia's sake. She adored her cousin. Letts could not rob her of that. Silence fell over the room like a weight. Claudia turned, stunned. Is it true, Gregory? Mellis stepped forward, his voice low. He would have forgiven me. In time. But he didn't, Holmes said gently. Instead, he wrote it down, tucked it into the box. Perhaps as insurance. Perhaps as a final testament. And someone knew. Someone close. Someone who feared exposure. Mellis's jaw tightened. You can't prove any of this. No. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded slip of paper. I retrieved this from a man you hired to set the second fire. Not the first, the one at Claudia's flat. A man recently released from prison for arson, paid in coin, not banknotes. That coin bears a minting unique to a Cairo vault, a vault accessible only to someone who once worked there. He placed the coin beside the decanter. Lestrade stepped forward, slow and certain. Mellis's eyes darted, seeking exit, but found none. He opened his mouth to speak, but Holmes raised a finger. One more thing. A book purchased last week from Finch's store, titled The Jackal and the Flame, a story about betrayal and survival. Holmes smiled faintly. Your name was in the receipt. You paid in coin, Mr. Mellit. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The silence in the drawing room was absolute, as if the very walls leaned in to hear Holmes speak. Mellis stood with his back pressed against the wainscoting, eyes darting from Holmes to Lestrade and back again, calculating his odds and finding no favorable outcome. Holmes stepped to the center of the room, folding his arms behind him like a lecturer before a class. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm and precise. The death of Arthur Letts was not the beginning of this tale, but rather the end of a long and buried thread. A betrayal older than most of us remember, its roots buried in desert sand and silence. He gestured toward Mellis without even looking at him. Mr. Gregory Mellis was not simply the long-lost cousin. He was the partner Arthur Letts believed dead in Egypt. The official account stated that Mellis had vanished during a failed excavation and was presumed lost to a sandstorm or some similar misfortune. But in truth, Mr. Mellis absconded with a significant sum of venture capital, ruining Letts's reputation and forcing him to return home in disgrace. Claudia's face was pale as moonlight. You lied to us, all those years. Mellis said nothing, only stared at the floor as if studying the grain of the wood might offer a solution. Holmes continued. Arthur Letts kept your secret, Mr. Mellis, for Claudia's sake. But guilt has its own timetable, and Letts, knowing his health was failing, sought to unburden himself. He placed a written confession, yours, into the Japanese puzzle box he purchased from Mr. Finch. That box, you'll recall, was known for its hidden compartment. Finch looked abashed, clearly realizing now the importance of the object he had so readily sold. Letts likely intended the puzzle box to be found after his passing. Perhaps he even hoped Claudia would destroy it unread. But you, Mr. Mellis, could not take that chance. You had come back to London under a new name and insinuated yourself once again into Claudia's life under the pretense of reconciliation. You learned of the puzzle box, or suspected its contents, and took the only action you believed would protect your carefully constructed lie. Mellis looked up at last, his voice dry. He was going to ruin everything. I had rebuilt my life. I made amends. No, sir, Holmes said quietly. You ran. You erased. That is not the same. Holmes began to pace slowly. The fire at the Letts estate was a distraction. It destroyed the puzzle box, but you were too late. Letts had already removed the letter. He had hidden it somewhere else. You didn't know where, and so you waited, carefully monitoring Claudia, thinking perhaps she might stumble upon it. But she did not. And so, in desperation, you lit a second fire, this time in her apartment, hoping either to find the letter or to frighten her into revealing it. You hired a known arsonist, paid in foreign coin traceable to the Cairo mint, stamped in a year matching the time frame of your supposed death. Watson looked toward the side table, where the coin still gleamed softly beneath the gaslight. But your unraveling began not with the fire, Holmes added, but with your choice of literature. He withdrew a small book from his coat pocket, The Jackal and the Flame. A rather obscure title, he said, but one with remarkable thematic resonance. You purchased it from Mr. Finch's shop only days ago, using a coin from Egypt. Your name, your real name, was noted in the store's ledger. Holmes handed the book to Lestrade. There is no great revelation, no magical moment of deduction, Holmes concluded. Only details, all of them patiently waiting for someone who knew where to look. Lestrade stepped forward, producing a pair of manacles. Gregory Mellis, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson and the murder of Arthur Letts. Mellis, cornered at last, looked to Claudia. His voice cracked. I never meant to hurt you. You didn't, she whispered, but you destroyed the man who raised me. As Lestrade escorted Mellis from the room, Holmes turned to me and offered a faint smile. Simple, really. I scoffed, incredulous. Simple for you, perhaps. You just rewrote 20 years of this man's life in less than 20 minutes. Holmes shrugged. Time has a way of hiding truth, Watson, but it does not erase it. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. A week had passed since the dramatic confrontation in Claudia Letts' drawing room, and yet the echoes of that evening lingered in my mind like the final notes of a haunting melody. London, in its usual indifference, rolled on, smoke curling above rooftops, carriages clattering down wet-cobbled lanes, and gossip drifting through clubs and cafes with tireless ease. But in Baker Street, we lived still with the aftermath. Lestrade, in a rare act of humility, had returned the next day to express his grudging admiration to Holmes. A clean case, he muttered, standing awkwardly with his bowler hat clutched in his hands. Clean once you explained it, that is. Scotland Yard owes you another debt. Holmes merely inclined his head, offering no more than a vague nod. I trust the evidence is sufficient to prevent any unfortunate legal acrobatics? Quite. Mellis confessed the moment the prison bars closed behind him. Something about facing Claudia again broke whatever was left of him. We recovered the second letter, by the way, hidden in the spine of an old ledger in Letts's study. Everything matched your deductions precisely. With a small grunt of satisfaction, Holmes returned to his violin, playing a slow, meditative strain that Lestrade wisely took as a cue to leave. The newspapers had wasted no time sensationalizing the affair. The Egyptian betrayal, a puzzle that solved a murder, one headline blared. Others focused on the more tragic romance of it all, Claudia's devotion, Letts' slow unraveling, and the fire that had almost claimed her life. Scotland Yard, predictably, stood at the center of most accounts, while Holmes was mentioned only in passing, if at all. I was indignant on his behalf, But Holmes, as always, was unbothered. "What matters," he said that evening as I laid the paper down with a scowl, "is not recognition, Watson, but resolution. A truth brought to light, a wrong made visible." He paused, then added in a softer tone, "And a woman no longer haunted by shadows she didn't know were following her." Still, Claudia Letts had not come to Baker Street. She had sent a letter, handwritten, elegant, sorrowful. "Mr. Holmes, I find I cannot yet face the place where all of this began, but I am grateful, more than I can say, for the clarity you gave me. The past, once buried, is not easily faced, but better that it be faced than be left to rot and fester in darkness. My uncle, my father in every way but blood, deserved that justice, and you gave it to him. I will rebuild. Perhaps not what was, but something that can be." Claudia Letts Holmes read it once, folded it neatly, and filed it away without comment. Yet I noticed, as the gaslight caught the edge of the envelope, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Later that night, as the city hummed softly outside, I asked him what I had been holding back since the day Mellis was arrested. "Holmes, if Mellis hadn't confessed, if we hadn't found that second letter, would the case still have held?" Holmes didn't look up from his armchair where he sat steepled in thought. "The case, Watson," he said, "was always there. Truth is not a matter of confession. It is a matter of convergence, where motive, opportunity, and evidence meet. Mellis might have remained silent. The letter might have been lost. But the coins, the purchase of the puzzle box, the timeline, the emotional strain, all of it still pointed in one direction. We had a tapestry. The threads were already in our hands." I leaned back, letting his words settle like dust over a map. "Do you ever grow tired of it?" I asked finally. "Of chasing human nature through these twisted corridors?" He looked at me, then truly looked. "No," he said, "because however twisted the corridors, they always lead to the same rooms: love, greed, guilt, fear. And in understanding those, Watson, we understand ourselves, even if only a little." A pause. Then, with a flick of his hand, he waved it all away. "But enough of sentiment. You still owe me a rematch in chess, and this time I suggest you keep your bishop out of danger." Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. The following morning dawned with a pale, watery light over Baker Street. Fog clung to the eaves and softened the corners of the world, muffling the sounds of hooves and footsteps and market calls into something hushed and almost reverent. A morning for silence. A morning for reflection. I found Holmes by the hearth, his long form silhouetted in profile against the window, a cup of tea cooling untouched beside him. The fire had burned low, leaving the room cloaked in soft greys and oranges, as if reluctant to surrender the atmosphere of the night before. He had been unusually still all morning, and though I'd long grown accustomed to his silences, this one held a peculiar weight. I seated myself quietly, waiting for him to speak. He did not. Instead, he reached for the worn puzzle box, the very one that had once held the letter from Edward Letts, and placed it on the table between us. "It's empty now," I said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And yet it still contains something, wouldn't you agree?" I tilted my head, not quite following. He ran a long, slender finger along the edge of the carved lid. "It contains the idea, the memory, the path it revealed. In its hollowness, there is still consequence. I find that poetic." There was something tired in his voice, not fatigue of the body, but of the mind, a weariness born not of deduction, but of understanding. I spoke gently. "You've never admitted to being sentimental, Holmes." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Nor shall I start now. Sentiment is the enemy of precision, after all." "And yet," I pressed, You keep the box." A pause. "It reminds me," he said slowly, "that not all puzzles are designed for amusement. Some are carved in desperation. Concealment born not from craft, but from pain. Edward Letts left behind a message not merely to solve a mystery, but to spare someone he loved from living in a lie. That's a different kind of deduction, Watson. A moral one." The fire cracked softly, casting brief flares of light across his face. He stared into them as though trying to read the past in flame. "I have seen many men kill for money, for revenge, for fear. Mellis killed for something simpler, yet no less dark, resentment, the slow rot of envy. Years of obedience, masking hatred. Letts never suspected the depth of it. And Claudia," he trailed off. "She'll carry it," I said, "but she'll survive it." "Yes," he said. "She's of strong fiber. The fire did not break her, it tempered her." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and opened his violin case. As he tuned the strings with the precision of a watchmaker, I took in the quiet dignity of him, lean, austere, a mind forged for logic, and yet not untouched by the human mess that logic must often clean. "Watson," he said, still adjusting the bridge, "do you remember what I told you the first time we met? You said I had returned from Afghanistan with a wounded shoulder, had no family in England, and was looking for economical lodgings." He gave a short laugh. "Yes, but I also said something else. That detection, properly applied, is the science of observation married to the art of inference." I nodded. "And yet," he continued, drawing the bow across the strings gently, "there are cases, rare ones, where deduction alone does not suffice, where motive lies, buried not in fingerprints or fibers, but in the soft, fragile chambers of the heart. We may map out the facts, but the why, the true why, often eludes the microscope." A long, low note hummed from the violin. Not melancholy, not joyful, simply present. "Then how did you solve it?" I asked. He lowered the violin and looked at me, clear-eyed, unblinking. "I listened," he said, "not to the words, to the silences between them. That, my dear Watson, is often where the truth hides." I could not speak for a moment. The simplicity of it struck me harder than any flourish of intellect. We sat in stillness for some time. Outside, the fog began to thin. A shaft of sunlight cut through the window pane and lit the surface of the puzzle box. Finally, Holmes placed the violin down and turned toward me with his customary air of finality. "Well," he said briskly, "that case is closed. And now, unless some new crime should emerge before tea, I intend to enjoy a rare moment of peace." He reached for the newspaper, flipped it open, and in his usual dry tone added, "Although knowing London, peace is a transient condition." I smiled. He was himself again, and I, as always, was left in quiet awe of the man. His mind, his heart, and the curious way in which both forever danced just out of reach.